הנה.
ורדה, אנחנו רוצים להתחיל את ההקלטה. ורדה, איפה את? לא נדע לעולם.
אני הייתי בלימודים עם טייסיטור רינפוצ'ה בדלי.
איזה כיף לך.
עם עוד כמה אנשים. זהו, סיימתי. ועכשיו תנסו לחפש טיסות לארץ.
I'm on mute.
All right.
Okay, you are with us.
Okay, I'm with you. Yes. Sorry,
Okay,
took a little longer.
You are now the co-host.
Okay, great.
I just want to say that because we are starting to be in the end of the text and we are going to finish this text. So each one that have a question to send us, if you can do it, about all the teaching on this text. So it will be lovely. That's all. Sorry, Geshe.
No, that's okay. Thank you. All right, let's start then. Breathing meditation. And then visualize in the space in front of you your own spiritual master, your Lama, as inseparable from the Buddha, appearing in the aspect of the Buddha. Wearing the saffron-colored robes of a monk. Seated in the full lotus posture. And basically reminding us of our own potential, helping us to actualize that potential by teaching us the Dharma. Teaching us in particular what is most important when it comes to all sentient beings. Who are surrounding us. Wherever there's space, think that there's a sentient being. All of them appearing as human beings. And while their subtlest mind is not affected by any of the afflictions or suffering. Their coarse mind is controlled by their rude misperception of reality and the resulting self-centeredness and other afflictions. And instead of experiencing peace and happiness that they crave, they constantly experience dissatisfaction, worry, anxiety. And other forms of suffering. And so remembering their incredible potential each one of them has, let's generate affectionate love. Seeing them as lovable, as deserving to be cared for. And generating this sense of closeness and acceptance. And that feeling of closeness then gives way to great compassion while focusing especially on all their unwanted experiences, focusing on all their afflictions, and sincerely, with great affection, wishing for them to be free from any of these dissatisfactory states. And also aspiring to be able to help them to overcome all their dissatisfactory experiences, all their limitations. And the aspiration to particularly be of benefit to sentient beings by helping them to overcome their suffering and its causes, then grows stronger, turns into the special altruistic attitude that is determined to do whatever it takes to help sentient beings overcome their limitations in the form of sufferings and afflictions. To basically take personal responsibility for the welfare of all sentient beings. Which we can, of course, only effectively accomplish if we become enlightened first, if we remove our own limitations and their causes. So understanding that, let's generate bodhicitta. A mind that wishes for the benefit of all sentient beings to become fully enlightened, to make that our main goal in life, our main aspiration. And let's think that it's also with this intention that we continue to study the 7-point mind training. But before we start, let's deepen our refuge and further strengthen our bodhicitta with a prayer. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. All right. Okay, so let's start with the question. Just a sec, I've got it right here. Where's the question? Questions, yep. Okay. So first, we have Shmuel's question. Introspection, attention towards our mind is considered. Okay, I'll blow this up a little more. Okay. Is considered basic to Buddhist practice. Yes, introspection, mindfulness, attention. And he writes, personally, I find the efforts to constantly pay attention to my mind can drain my energies. Do you have an idea why that may happen? Okay. Why that happens? Because we're not used to it. Anything we do, I guess, if we exercise, I mean, if you go jogging or, I don't know, practice yoga or bodybuilding or whatever, anything we do, in the beginning, it's very tiring. I mean, we only do it a few hours, maybe every day. But even then, it's extremely exhausting in the very beginning. And then as we continue to do this, well, then, of course, we get better at it and we are less exhausted. Now, here we're asked to be introspective, attentive, and mindful all the time. And we're not used to it. We're so used to allowing our mind to wander. But I think it's important here to also be careful not to overdo it. If you feel you're exhausted, let it go. I mean, to do as much as we can. And if we can't do it all the time, maybe every 5 minutes to check, oh, am I mindful or not? And then go back to maybe daydreaming and so forth. It's impossible to right away focus the mind. I mean, if we are introspective and attentive and mindful all the time, that means we have reached a very advanced level of concentration, because those are the main mental factors at work when we have concentration. So that level of concentration takes time, takes a lot of effort, it's difficult to attain. And I think it's important to find a middle way between being too lax and too tight. So yeah, to do as much as we can, but not to lose our joy. That would be important, not to lose our this joyfulness, this enjoyment of doing exactly this. And then if you feel like it's tiring, well, maybe just let go for a few moments and allow for the mind to wander, but hold your attention to a certain degree that doesn't wander off towards, I don't know, non-virtuous thoughts. And even if they do arise, which, well, due to our habituation, of course they will, well, then to gently bring the mind back. So being gentle with our own mind is really important, and to not lose the sense of enjoyment. And then it just takes time. So unfortunately, the way sometimes these practices are described, they're like practice like as if you're talking to an advanced practitioner. Be mindful at all time, be introspective all the time, be mindful all the time. And then, well, if we then approach it by way of like trying really hard, then we grow exhausted, and before long we stop doing it. So I think it's important to just do a little bit in the beginning, as much as we can, and then slowly enhance it, just as we would do when we exercise. All right. Then his next question is, in the very beginning of Buddhist practice, as newcomers to the Dharma, we should regulate our verbal and physical behavior. Yes, that is most important. To mainly focus on those two. It seems to me that for that, we need mainly to pay attention to our body and speech, and only secondarily to pay attention to our mind. Would you agree? Well, if our body and our speech were like totally different, what would you call it? Like different entities that are not, or different, that there are different entities, but like not controlled by the mind. They just do their own thing. So you'd have a mind that does its own thing. You have body and speech that do their own thing. I would agree. But body and speech are controlled by the mind. So it's the mind that is responsible for what we say. The mind is responsible for how we move about, whether we may push someone out of the way versus kind of walking around them when we're in a rush and so forth. Now, I do agree, though, there's a certain type of mind here, a certain type of awareness, a certain type of consciousness we need to regulate. It's not that we need to, I mean, if we can, of course, that's great, but to focus on all or pay attention to all types of consciousness in the beginning is overwhelming. So it should be consciousness that controls verbal and physical behavior. That is the most, in the beginning, that should be our main focus. So, for instance, if we get angry, well, it's not possible right from the beginning to regulate our anger in that we suppress it. I mean, we shouldn't suppress it anyway, because then it may come back stronger. So we need to be skillful about it, but also we won't be able to overcome the subtler forms of anger right away. There are coarser forms of anger and there are subtler forms. So to regulate the coarser forms of anger. So what are the coarser? What does coarse anger mean here? The kind of anger that induces harsh speech, for instance, negative non-virtuous speech or non-virtuous physical actions. Why is it called coarse? What makes it coarse? Well, coarse in the sense that it's easily perceivable. I mean, we can easily perceive it. We can easily be aware of. We ourselves, we're much more aware of our coarse anger, the kind of anger that makes us say things that we may later regret or do things that we later regret. So that kind of anger is coarse because we're aware of it. Then there's subtler forms of anger. It's still anger, but it's subtler in that, first of all, we're not really aware of it, but it also doesn't necessarily give rise to, I don't know, harsh speech, insult, and so forth. We may still be standing there smiling, right, with a smile on our face, and people may not at all be aware that we are angry. We ourselves may not really be aware of it. And even if we are aware, this kind of anger does not give rise to negative verbal and physical behavior, which is why in the beginning, it's the type of anger that gives rise to negative verbal and physical behavior we need to deal with first, this coarser type, and then move on to the subtler type. Which is why, in a certain way, to a certain degree, I agree with you. In a certain way, I agree with you in that it's not all types of consciousness. I mean, if we can do it, it's great. But the subtler minds, for the time being, we may want to leave to the side and focus more on the coarser minds, those that give rise to negative verbal and physical behaviors. Does that make sense? Okay. I hope it does. If not, Shmuel, you're welcome to ask again. Okay. Then Jimmy's question. It's a clarification regarding his last question from the 8th. All right. So he says, in my last question, asking whether the Bodhisattva will be dependent arising centered, I was just wondering how the two, dependent arising, the self, are related. Is the self an object of dependent arising? Does it ever dependently arise at all? I would say that no, the self never actually arises either dependently nor independently. Only the consciousness that imagines a self arises dependently, because in fact, in the process of dependent arising, there's no self at all. It's just a non-dual experience of various physical sensations and mental states. Is that true or not? Okay, therefore, when we focus on dependent arising, we see no self at all. All we see is the dependent arising of the consciousness that imagines a self. When in actuality, there is no self in dependent arising. Therefore, from being self-centered, we become dependent arising centered. Is that right or not? Okay, now I understand where he's coming from. I don't think I understood it correctly last time. This is a little confusing in Tibetan. I mean, in Tibetan Buddhism, or in Buddhism of the Nalanda tradition, in the type of Buddhism of the Nalanda tradition, because the way the term self is used can be very confusing. There are basically, I guess you could say, 3 meanings of the term self, 3 different meanings. In different contexts, self means different things. First of all, if you have the term selflessness, so here the word self is used when we talk of selflessness. And selflessness, the self of which, well, the self which is lacking as of, when we talk about selflessness, that self is the non-existent self. That self can refer either, and there's already 2 of the 3 meanings of selflessness. It can either refer to the inherently existent self, an inherently existent self. So the way, for instance, I perceive of myself in certain situation, when someone insults me, when someone abuses me, and there's a strong sense, an inherently existent, there's a strong sense. It's not just I as in like conventional I. No, it's a sense of an inherent I that I now need to defend, that I need to at other times gratify, and so forth. So at certain times we have a very strong sense of an inherently existent self. Now that inherent self doesn't exist, which is indicated by the term selflessness. Or sometimes we use the term selflessness in the form of a coarser type of selflessness, having a sense that there's a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, like a self that exists independent of mind and body, which is slightly coarser than the sense of a self that is inherently existent. We don't need to go into that now. But the point is, again, we imagine there to be a self, as Jimmy wrote, we imagine there to be a self which actually doesn't exist, which is just it's just made up by our imagination. It's just, what do you call it? Like it's imagined. It's made up by our mind. It's wrongly imputed by our mind. That is one way of referring to the self. It's like an imagined, a wrongly perceived I. But sometimes the term self, when we talk about selflessness, refers to just inherent existence in general. So then you talk about selflessness of a table, for instance. Now, the table, when we say the table doesn't exist inherently, here we're not saying the table is not an inherent I. That doesn't make sense. I mean, no one perceives the table to be an inherently existent person or an inherently existent I. But we still speak of the selflessness of the table, which is why the term self, when we say selflessness of the table, here can also refer to inherent existence. So selflessness of the table refers to the non-inherent existence of the table, or the self of the table refers to the inherent existence of the table. Okay, now again, selflessness can sometimes be used to refer to the inherent self, and sometimes it can, or a self-sufficient self, or any type of self that doesn't exist, any kind of imagined self, permanent, partless, independent, or self-sufficient, substantially existent, inherent. So if you've studied philosophy, then, I mean, for those of you who've studied philosophy, you're aware of probably of this terminology. So it can refer to this imagined, wrongly imagined self, but it can also refer to inherent existence. Those are two usages of the term self, and neither of these exist. But there's a third usage of the term self, which is the conventional I, the conventional self, the I that is merely labeled, the I that is labeled just as a table is labeled, the self that is merely designated on the basis of its parts, just as everything else that exists is merely labeled on the basis of its parts. Now, if we say the self has these three meanings, or let's put it differently, if we say that the term self is used in those three ways, in some contexts, it means an I that doesn't exist, that is merely imagined. In some cases, it means, in some contexts, it refers to inherent existence. And in some contexts, it refers to the existent self. The question that now arises philosophically, does the self exist or not in general? If you have these three different meanings, and in the case of two of them, the self doesn't exist. In the case of one meaning, it does. Does the self exist or not? And the answer philosophically would be yes. Yes, because if of these three meanings, one exists, then the self exists. Just saying that two don't exist doesn't mean the self doesn't exist. This is just a philosophical kind of aspect. It's maybe a little bit difficult to understand. It's a bit like saying there's no elephant in my room. There's also no elephant in my bathroom. And there's no elephant on my balcony, right? There are more places where there are no elephants. So there are more places where in this world, there are more places where the non-existence of elephant exists. Does that mean there are no elephants? Just because there's so many non-existent, no, not non-existent. Yeah, there's so many occasions of non-existent elephants. No, because if there's just one elephant, that's enough to say that there's an elephant. So it's that kind of logic. It's that kind of, there was just one. If you have like a whole category of things, but only one example of this category exists, then you have to say that this object, this phenomenon exists. So that's the logic behind it. If the self in some contexts refers to the imagined self, which doesn't exist, or it refers to inherent existence, which doesn't exist, but it also refers to the I. In other cases, we have to say in general, the self exists. Okay. Now just that on the philosophical level. So when you debate in the context of, well, regarding the subject of self, it follows that it exists. The other person says, Why? I mean, if they disagree, if they say no, it doesn't exist, well, then you argue, well, the self exists because the conventional self exists. The other person says, well, no, that doesn't mean just because the conventional self exists, doesn't mean the self exists, because there is the self which refers to the inherent existence, or the self that refers to an imagined kind of I, right? If the person argues in that way, if they don't agree with that, then the person debating would still insist, well, the self, but if just one self exists, one type of self exists, which is the conventional, then that means self in general exists. That would be the argument. So within a debate, well, someone may disagree, but if in the end, it wouldn't make sense, because we can go back to the example of the elephant. Even if there's just one elephant in the world, we say elephant exists. Okay. And here in this case, of course, we talk about many, all sentient beings have a self, a conventional self. This is why I kept saying, well, the self does exist, but the self you're referring to here is the non-existent self. Just from the context, it becomes clear it's a non-existent self. So I agree with you. If you're strictly talking about the non-existent self, and the way you use the terminology, use the term here, it seems, because you're talking about dependent arising centered, and here self-centered. So self here, the way you use the term self here, seems to refer to inherent existence. So inherent existence centered doesn't exist. Then dependent arising centered exists. Yes, that is right. So you're right in that way. However, now the question is, when we say a person is self-centered, what does that self refer to? What does that self refer to? Is it the existent self? Is it the imagined self? Or is it inherent existence? Which one is it? When I say, I am selfish, right? So being self-centered, doesn't that mean the same as being selfish? Doesn't it mean that here the self refers to the I, which believes it's the center of the universe, right? So I would argue, when we use the term self-centered, the self is not the same as when we use the term selflessness. It's the existent self. I would, according to my understanding of, and that's debatable, this is just my personal opinion, but when we say, for instance, in Tibetan, the Tibetan word is actually self-cherishing, cherishing the self. Cherishing the self. Of course, there may be times when we cherish an imagined self. Definitely. Our mind believes the self to be, we focus on, for instance, we concentrate on the self that doesn't exist, the inherent I, and then have the thought, I'm better than everyone else. In that case, the self-centered, that kind of self, is the non-existent one. But I'm wondering, are there also times when there's a sense of the I, a conventional I, thinking of oneself from the point of view of the conventional I, and then holding ourselves to be superior to everyone else? Because it's not the case that we don't perceive the conventional I at all. Because if we never perceive the conventional I, then that would mean we never perceive the conventional table. We never perceive anything, basically, right? Because sometimes we perceive it inherent tables. At times, that's my table, and we perceive this inherently existent table. We perceive everything at some point. Well, everything, not everything, but the objects of our attachment or the object of our anger, at some point, we perceive all of them to exist inherently. So, but it's still debatable. Self-centered. Yeah, it's a little difficult. This is actually a good point. It's a good point Jimmy is making in terms of what is that self? well, anyway, just going back to, because I just had a second thought, but going back to these different objects like tables and cars and so forth, when we don't have an affliction that manifests, that is active, when we just sit somewhere, look around, and oh, there's a table, there's a car, there's a mountain, these are not wrong consciousnesses. These objects, the mountain, the chair, the car, all those appear to exist inherently, but that doesn't mean we perceive them to exist that way. We perceive them as chairs, as tables, etc. And so we perceive objects that do exist. So we perceive conventional tables, cars, etc. Are we aware they exist conventionally? No, we're not aware of that. But the objects we perceive are in fact conventionally existent, the merely labeled objects. Now, if that's true with regard to the objects around us, then that's also true with regard to the self. Every now and then, we perceive the self we perceive a self that does exist, the conventional self. For instance, the thought, I'm walking, I'm listening to a class, I'm meditating. Is that a wrong consciousness? Because if the I, in this case, that thinks I'm meditating, for instance, were the inherent I, then that consciousness thinking I'm meditating would be a wrong consciousness, because something that doesn't exist can't meditate, right? So if the I, when I'm thinking I'm meditating, if that I were the non-existent I, then that mind itself, that doesn't mean I can't be meditating, but that's besides the point. I'm just talking about the mind. Is that is a correct mind or not? A correct mind, whether a mind is correct or not, is determined by whether its main object exists or not. Now, when I'm thinking I'm meditating, well, me meditating, that's the main object. And if the I doesn't exist, then there's no I meditating, there's no meditation. And so the object of that mind would be non-existent. But it's not true that whenever we think about the I'm walking, I'm talking, I'm eating, that these are wrong consciousnesses. No, I am eating at times. I am walking at times and so forth. I'm doing all these things because there is a conventional self. And when there's no affliction at hand, when there's no affliction, when I'm just having thoughts about this, that, and the other concerning myself, then that I is the conventional I. But going back to self-centeredness. So this is difficult. When I actually have the thought, I'm the center of the universe, I'm better than everyone else, is that I the conventional I or not? No, actually it's not. Actually, it's not. So when we talk about the thought itself, when we're self-centered, I said something slightly different before, but actually thinking about it, when there is this strong sense of I'm more important, my happiness is more important, that is not a realistic mind. That is no longer, this is an affliction. And afflictions don't perceive phenomena as they really are. There's some who would say that an affliction, some would say that the affliction that perceives, for instance, an affliction such as anger that perceives another person, always perceives this other person as inherently existent, never perceives the person for who they are. Some would disagree, but it makes sense to say that in that moment, when we perceive someone to be horrible, when we hate them, when we have this hatred towards this person, that we perceive this person to be inherently being inherent person. Or if we don't do that, but at least we don't perceive them for who they are, we perceive them as 100% negative, and everyone would definitely agree with that. Whether we perceive them to exist inherently or not, there's some disagreement, but we definitely, when we hate someone, we definitely perceive this person as 100% negative and terrible, which is not in accordance with reality. Now, when we're self-centered, when we're really selfish, we perceive ourselves as more precious, as more important than others. And again, that is not realistic. So that is not a realistic self. Whether we perceive ourselves in that moment as inherently existent is debatable. Some would say yes, some would maybe disagree, but that we exaggerate, that we perceive a self that doesn't exist is definitely the case. Okay, but when we say another person is self-centered, but we actually look at another person and we don't hate them, we don't have anything against them, we just see the person and we look at their behavior, we see the person, we can actually perceive this person, this self, right? I mean, I don't know, we don't use the term in everyday language. Yes, we do actually. Yourself. We talk about yourself, myself. So in that sense, self can be used to also refer to another person. And so when we look at another person and then say they're self-centered, in that moment, when we, without anger, without affliction, just note that they're self-centered, then that self exists. I don't have a problem saying that that exists. So the self-centered mind itself, perceives a self that doesn't exist. But self-centered, if someone is self-centered, that doesn't mean that that self doesn't exist necessarily, because when we look at another person, or when I reflect back in time, oh, I was really self-centered yesterday. I myself, the conventional I, was really selfish, right? The conventional, so without having self-centeredness in that moment, right? So is that person self-centered? I would say yes, they're self-centered. Okay. Anyway, here this is totally, I never thought about this way, so I'm really thinking aloud here. I hope I didn't confuse you too much. It's an important point. It's really interesting. I would say that when we say self-centered, someone is self-centered, I was self-centered today, I am right now, and so forth, that mind is a correct mind. We're not talking about the self-centeredness itself, but rather the mind itself, because the mind itself, of course, does exist, but the self that it perceives, we can say doesn't exist. But the self-centered, the self of self-centered does exist. So anyway, sorry, I think I'm confusing you more than anything. But let's, if we go with what I just said at the very end, that the self of the term self-centered is the existent self. Therefore, here we become dependent arising centered. It's okay. I mean, in the sense that, but they're not contradictory. When you're self-centered, you're dependently arising centered, because the self exists, it's dependently risen, and therefore, if you're self-centered, or if I'm self-centered, I'm dependently arisingly, in a dependent arising way, centered. So there's therefore no contradiction between the two, self-centered and dependent arising centered. All right. So, but a person who has overcome self-centeredness, are they dependent arising centered? No, because this term centered indicates an extreme that is, well, it depends which language you use. In English, being centered, yeah, well, okay, let's not use the word centered. Maybe the Tibetan term. The Tibetan term is slightly different. Okay, so when we say self-cherishing and cherishing others, in the case of self-cherishing, the cherishing is seen as an extreme. So a conventional I considers itself to be more precious than others. That's what we call self-cherishing. Because again, okay, let me mention again why I'm saying the self has to exist, because if the self didn't exist when we talk about self-cherishing, then there wouldn't be any self-cherishing, because something that doesn't exist can't cherish itself. All right, that's probably the easiest way to put it. So what flying cows, for instance, don't exist. Are flying cows centered? Are flying cows selfish? No, they're not. They don't exist. Therefore, since self-centeredness exists, the self that is centered here, that is selfish here, must exist. Okay. Now, dependent arising centered or dependent arising cherishing, well, whichever cherishing you use, self or other, since the cherishing does exist, it has to be dependently arisen. All right. Sorry, I got confused myself. So, Jimmy, in answer to your question, if you can still follow me, is everyone really confused now, or can you kind of follow me a little bit now still?
I will listen a couple more times the recording.
Okay, you have to listen to this again and probably ignore a few things I said. Yeah, but okay, just to summarize here. Here the self, I would say, there's of course a non-existent self, there's existent self, but here, in order to be self-centered, to be self-cherishing, which is the Tibetan term literally translated, the self has to exist, because for something to cherish itself, the itself has to exist. Something non-existent can't cherish itself, but self-centeredness exists. Flying cow centeredness doesn't exist. Flying cows cherishing doesn't exist. I mean, well, cherishing a flying cow. Now I have to think of it again. Oh God, cherishing a flying cow. Could I cherish a flying cow? Can I cherish something that doesn't exist?
It would be like cherishing a barren woman's son or something, wouldn't it?
Can I cherish something that doesn't? Can something that meditate exists? No. Oh, no. Self-cherishing means that the thing cherishes itself. Okay. So I can cherish something that doesn't exist. However, the self-cherishing refers to, okay, I can't do it right now. Sorry, I need to be in a quiet room.
You want to say that the flying cow can't cherish itself because the flying
That's
cow
right.
does not exist.
That's it. Exactly. Very good. Thank you. Exactly it. Yes. So the flying cow can't cherish. So when we talk about self-cherishing, we're referring to something cherishing itself. Yes. Very good. Orit, yes. So the cow, therefore, in the same way as a flying cow can't cherish itself. Great. That's it. That's the answer to it. Therefore, Jimmy, self-centeredness does exist. The self, therefore, does exist, which is why we don't need to talk about dependent arising centeredness. But think about it again and ask again, because I really liked how you went back to this. And yeah, well, the main point I'm trying to make is that it's really difficult with the terminology sometimes, that you have the same word used in different ways in different contexts. Now, you may feel that is not a good idea, but confusion is good, right? As part of the process of learning. If it's a little confusing, we have to be more focused, right? Pay more attention, give it more thought. I mean, right now I spent so much time because I got totally confused. So, which makes me go back when I'm not in front of a screen, etc., just on my own. Then I start thinking about it. So it gives me the opportunity to reflect on it more. And in that way, sometimes it is done, I believe, on purpose, just for us to keep on our toes, to stay on our toes. All right. Anyway, that should be enough. with the questions. Sorry, I spent a really long time on that today. Let's go to Lamrim. I really like to do a little bit Lamrim at least, because it's patience now and we don't have that much time left. So patience. Well, let's spend more time next time on it because I've spent so much on the questions. Again, change of plan, just to be able to go a little bit more through the text. Okay. So, where did we get to? Adopt the 3 principal conditions. And in that context, because this is something I also wanted to address briefly, the 3 principal conditions, as they're called, about afflictions. So in that context, patience also comes up in the context of anger versus patience. So patience, we talk about patience. For instance, there are 3 forms. Patience in the eye of being, patience when we're harmed, when someone harms us. Patience with a difficult task when we've set a certain goal, so to be patient with the hardship that it involves, and patience with trying to understand ultimate reality. Now, these 3 forms of patience, this is the kind of patience as part of the Lamrim. So if you want to give it some time, if you want to meditate on it, it's important to understand that these 3 forms, only the first one is what we usually associate with, or what we usually consider to be patience, because the first type of patience is an antidote to anger. The second type of patience, now I might as well quickly go. Yeah, patience of enduring difficulties. So patience of not retaliating is like in the face of being harmed, insulted, etc. So the opposite of that is anger. Here we're patient, we're forbearing in the sense of not getting angry. Patience of enduring difficulties, this is not referring to anger. This is not being forbearing. It's the object to overcome here, the object to avoid here is not anger, but it's discouragement, feeling discouraged. So when we endure difficulties, especially when it comes to the Dharma, being attentive, being mindful, being introspective, as part of the question that Shmuel asked previously. So here in this case, when we endure difficulties, well, we're patient in such a way that we don't allow ourselves to be discouraged. And then patience of definitely practicing the Dharma, or sometimes it's also put in the way of saying patience with trying to realize the ultimate nature, or, well, let's say practicing the Dharma, not to dislike. Here the thing to counteract here is the dislike for practicing the Dharma. Okay. Now, those 3 we have to practice. We should practice all 3 as part of the practice of patience. But I want to mention here the first type of patience once again in the context of, I talked about the afflictions last time. The afflictions, wait, where is it? The 3 difficult challenges. Yes. Number 6, train in the 3 difficult challenges, because one thing I didn't mention last time, this is one of the most important parts of mind training, applying the antidotes when it's necessary. So to notice in the beginning when an affliction arises, to notice it when it arises, to apply the antidotes, to then keep applying the antidotes so that the affliction weakens, and in the end to discontinue the particular affliction. So be aware of the affliction when it arises and starting to apply the antidote, then fully applying the antidote to decrease the affliction, and then to totally stop the affliction. Okay, these 3 steps. Now, when it comes to anger, the antidote here is patience. Okay, so patience in that moment, to patience as a mental factor that when the anger arises, it sets in, it starts to arise, or we we make it arise, we generate it in order then for the anger to weaken and to totally disappear. Okay, now what is this anger? What is it about anger or attachment? So these are usually mainly explained, and then with the other afflictions, it's easy to understand what they are. I mean, you can just then apply the same logic to the other ones. Oftentimes, anger is described as a mind that exaggerates the negativity of the other person and feels therefore angry with that person. That is true, but there's a little bit more to it. The same can be said about attachment. So attachment exaggerates the positive aspect of the object of attachment, sees it as more positive, sees it as greater than it actually is not able to see its disadvantages, for instance, or its negative qualities, and then cannot let go. That is also true, but again, there's more to it. In that, we need to consider the way in which we come, the way these afflictions arise. Now, just talking about anger and attachment. Anger, in the case of anger, we observe an object, we perceive an object, we focus on the negative quality, and then we exaggerate that negative quality. That exaggeration of the negative quality precedes the anger. So we exaggerate. It's in English sometimes called the exaggerating quality or the inappropriate attitude. The Tibetan term literally means the inappropriate attitude, which doesn't tell us much because anger is inappropriate, but it's not called the inappropriate attitude. Therefore, the Tibetan term is sometimes translated an exaggerating attitude. So let's say, for instance, we're with someone and they say something, I don't know, they insult us. So of course, because of self-centeredness, I feel like, oh, they said that to me. So there's this whole process of the self-centered mind arising. Me, I've been insulted. And there's this pleasure. There's an unpleasant feeling. If the same words were spoken to someone I dislike, there's pleasure. Okay, but in this case, since the words were directed at me, there's displeasure, there's dislike. Now, then what happens? This is before the exaggerating attitude arises as part of the process of anger arising. Then the next step would then be, wow, they're so bad to say that. This person is so bad. Right? There's a process of like, how dare they say that? This guy, this woman, they're terrible. So we exaggerate the words that they've just spoken. They now define this person. Now, we don't take long to come to that conclusion. It seems like we need a few hours to get to that point. Oh no, it's so quick, right? So someone whom we previously may have liked, or we've been felt indifferent towards, suddenly says something that really, really deeply hurts us. So there's a displeasure. And the next reaction is, so there's first of like, oh, right? Wow. So our focus is not on the other person yet. We just have to digest it for a moment. And then we focus on the person, the person who said those words. The thought, how dare they? Oh my God, they're just so horrible. And this action of having said, having insulted us, now defines them. So it's actually just a part of them. It's a part of, they've said something, but they've said this, that, and the other. It's not them. It's like this statement by them. We differentiate actually when we express it in words. We talk about what they've said and the person, him or herself. But in our mind, those two become one. And it's that person who said this to us in that moment, who's just so negative. That is the exaggerating attitude, which a moment later then gives rise to anger. This feeling of like this deep dislike, this feeling of, it's hard to put it into words. I mean, every moment of anger is different, like just disgust or the wish to be away from them or the wish to harm them. this is all this emotional response that goes together with this exaggerated way of seeing the person. So it's one mind, one mental factor, one consciousness that at the same time, while it exaggerates the negativity of this person and sees this person as one with the negativity, at the same time dislikes that person or feels angry with them. So the exaggerating aspect of seeing this negativity as one with the person, that preceded the anger. But then the mind continues to hold on to this exaggerated negativity and feels anger at the same time. That is called anger. So you see that there's a step-by-step process. And here, when we understand this, so we need to learn to identify these steps. When you're insulted, for instance, good opportunity. So how you feel, there are just these split seconds of just trying to make sense of what I just heard and just feeling this hurt inside. And then our focus is on the other person. There's this exaggerating attitude, which then gives rise to that continuous exaggeration, but also the feeling of anger. Now, the same you can apply to attachment. I would say attachment takes a little longer. Attachment takes a little longer. It's harder to get rid of. They describe it as similar to oil in paper, soaked in paper. But it's not like we meet someone, we attach to them right away. Usually it takes some time. Craving, again, a little different. But let's just talk about attachment in that we exaggerate the good qualities of that person. That precedes our not being able to let go of them. So again, we feel good, we focus on how we feel in their present, and then, oh, they make me feel like that. Oh, they're so great, they're so wonderful, they're so this, that, and the other. And so seeing particular qualities, particular characteristics as one with that person, and now not being able to let go of them, being responsible for that feeling of that pleasant feeling, and so therefore not being able to let go. That's attachment. And so if we understand that process, then it's much easier to apply the antidotes, because when we first there's the hurt in the case of anger. Oh, right. So I know my mind is going to turn to anger, right? Someone insults me and I'm like, whoa. So if I know myself well enough, I can go, okay, now I know I'm going to exaggerate the negativity of that person. I'm going to do this. This is the next step. So maybe I can actually stop myself starting that process. Or if I start that process of exaggerating, go, oh, wait a minute, but they've also done this and they have these are good qualities. So I can actually stop the anger before it arises, right? And so oftentimes, the people we're closest to, we're angry with the most. We're angry with there's certain behavioral patterns that we go through all the time. So we repeat them again and again with the same person, maybe our partners, maybe our siblings, maybe our parents, maybe our children. I don't know. Usually people we're close to. And again, here we have the opportunity, because we know our reaction, to break it. To break this habit by recognizing this. This I wanted to stress in particular. Okay, now, anyway, having said this, now we've talked about the 3 principal conditions. Oh, no, we didn't. Did we? I don't remember now. But anyway, the next point is then adopt the 3 principal conditions, which here the text is basically saying it's important to find a qualified spiritual master, which doesn't mean we have to be super close to them. It doesn't mean they know us personally. No, someone like a qualified master here is not just an ordinary teacher, but like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, like Kyabche Jadu Rinpoche, these amazing lamas who embody the teachings. So they can inspire us through their own actions. And we don't need to make a decision, this is now my root guru, let's celebrate the finding of my root guru. No. It's not about that. It's more about finding this kind of advanced lama who inspires us, and then listen to their teachings and practice them. That's the first step. And then we need a conducive mind. that also possesses confidence, I can do it, discernment, and a form of diligence. That's the same type of mind, the second type of mind, like a workable mind, and a conducive mind. And thirdly, well, the three principal conditions would also be to create the external necessities for Dharma practice. So to have possibly a place we can practice in, having enough food and drink, to maybe do extended periods of practice, of retreat, and so forth. So these are we adopt the three principal conditions as basically saying, work towards these three principal conditions if you haven't done so yet. So this would be important as part of our practice. In other words, we need a guide, and even just following the Buddha is the greatest guide. So even though we don't meet the Buddha, we can still have devotion and feel this feeling of being inspired and so forth. Or if it's a living master, even if the living master lives at the other end of the world, never mind, on the other side of the world, well, never mind, still we can have access to their teachings. Nowadays in particular, we have access. So it's most important to listen to their teachings and put them into practice. And for that, of course, we need a certain mind. The second condition here, a conducive mind that has qualities such as confidence, diligence, a certain degree of discernment, and so forth. And of course, the external necessities. Then, point number 8, it's important to contemplate the three aspects, the three that are free of degeneration. So 3 aspects that we shouldn't compromise, which are devotion and respect for our spiritual master. That is important. So to have that devotion in the sense of, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be critical, doesn't mean we shouldn't be skeptical, especially in the beginning. But it doesn't mean we accept everything they say, but we focus on their qualities as well, and with skepticism we can still be critical, but also be devoted in the sense of practicing especially those teachings that speak to us, that affect us in a certain way, to really put them into practice, and of course have a certain degree of respect, which of course we shouldn't just have for our spiritual Lama, for our spiritual master or our Lama, but also for other sentient beings. But it's a different type of respect just based on the fact that they teach us the Dharma, which is so precious. That's the first aspect we shouldn't compromise. So devotion and respect for our Lama, or Lamas, then enthusiasm and joy in training the mind. That kind of enthusiasm and joy are so important. So to work with that, not do too much, not do too little, because if we do too little, joy and enthusiasm are difficult to arise. If we do too much, they won't arise. It's impossible for them to arise. So to find that balance, that healthy balance. And then we need a certain degree of conscientiousness and vigilance, attentiveness when it comes to our own actions of body, speech, and mind. So that's also important. And again, it takes us back to mindfulness and so forth. So these should not be compromised. All right. Then the next point is be endowed with the 3 inseparable factors. This is saying that not only should be as part of the previous 3 points. So you have the 3 that are free. So we should always be vigilant and conscientious when it comes to the actions of our body, speech, and mind. But here it's saying more specifically, not only should we be vigilant, not only should we be mindful, but we should not be separated from virtuous actions. And again, of course, this is not easy. We can't do it perfectly, but to give our best, in other words, right? For our body, speech, and mind not to be separated from virtuous actions. So we should use our body as often as we can to do, for instance, prostrations and circumambulations. But these are just examples. I guess you could also count a kind smile. I mean, any actions of kindness for other sentient beings. So to give our best to perform physical virtuous actions, to give our best when it comes to our speech, to use our speech in a virtuous way. So the commentaries talk about saying mantras, requesting the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas to help us and so forth. But that's not all, of course. It's also kindness, being kind to other people with our own words, with our speech. And of course, our mind should not be without the mind of enlightenment, bodhicitta, to have that present. And it doesn't matter if you fake it, if you force it. I mean, not force in like, oh, I hate doing this, but I'll do it anyway. Not that kind of force, but just again and again, just even if it's fake, may I become enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings. You see a sentient being somewhere out on the street or more than one, may I become enlightened. So you don't really feel it from the depth of your heart, but you try again and again. And of course, it's part of your personal practice. You can generate love and compassion before you generate bodhicitta, and then based on that, generate bodhicitta, and just continue doing that every day. It doesn't matter how fake it feels. It doesn't matter that it is fake. This is the only way to generate bodhicitta, to familiarize with it. Okay. Then train constantly toward the chosen objects. So here it talks about the chosen objects means, what is it? Is it 10? Number 10? Yeah, train constantly towards the chosen objects. Here it refers to engaging in mind training that is pure and unbiased towards all sentient beings. So it doesn't matter who they are, the chosen objects, so whether they're friends or strangers or enemies, to constantly train towards them, to choose them as an object of mind training and not to be biased. So to choose all sentient beings, therefore, instead of saying, oh, this person, yes, but not them. Oh, my enemies, no. Of course, in the beginning, we have to be careful. We may not be able to include all sentient beings. And here we need to check our own mind. If aversion arises because, oh, this person I really can't stand. Okay. But at some point, okay, maybe I can exclude them today, but tomorrow I try a little harder. And maybe also connect to them on a subtler level. Not just focusing on the coarser mind that is active right now, but also remembering that on the subtler level, they have this incredible mind that doesn't differ from the mind of a Buddha. So we may actually connect to them on that level. Anyway, so to be free from bias when it comes to objects, the objects of our practice, here in particular persons. And cherish all inclusive and deep practices. So in the practice of mind training, we should value all practices, all the different types, even though we may not be able to practice them right away, but to cherish them still, to see them as important, to value them as profound and deep mental exercises, and to be open to them, that maybe one day or at some point this may be something helpful, because they're just different techniques. So to not close ourselves to certain techniques, because we keep constantly changing, our situation is changing, and the practices we need to do, they also change. And so we may find, oh, if we're open to certain techniques, at some point, because of that openness, we're more likely to adopt it and integrate it into our personal practice. And then meditate constantly on those who've been set apart. So this refers to certain living beings who are, for them, it's sometimes most difficult to practice, but still very, very rewarding. So in some of the commentaries, there are 5 groups of people mentioned. So for instance, in Tishan Rinpoche's commentary, he talks about our relatives. Oh yeah, we all know relatives. It's not easy. We sometimes have complicated relationships with our relatives, with some more than with others. But yes, our practice should, of course, also include them, our parents. So they're particularly close to us. But even then, it can be hard because of, I don't know, certain unresolved issues we may have with them, or whatever other reasons. So this is a group of people, they have been set apart, and we should constantly meditate as much as we can, constantly include them as well. And I guess it doesn't say much more about it, but would make sense to me that this refers to our difficult relationships with them, because then it also mentions our enemies or opponents we have. So actual enemies in the traditional sense of the term, or opponents, like someone, I don't know, at work who's like an opponent to me, who works against me, for instance. Here, it's so rewarding. This mind training is so rewarding when it comes to people we have difficult relationships with, including, well, relatives, friends, relatives, parents, or here enemies and opponents, or living beings who are ill disposed towards us. I mean, who are negative towards us, who treat us in a bad way, in a negative way, who insult us, etc., even though we've helped them. So it's not just enemies and opponents, but it's really those who should be grateful to what we've done to them, how we've helped them, and they react in an opposite way. And living beings who, because of some karmic connection we have, some negative karmic connection, we find repulsive, or who may find us repulsive. So these are all, it's difficult here. Like a stranger is okay, or a person I like, that's relatively easy, but here that's more difficult. And with the parents, it doesn't mention like difficult relationships, but it's still, it's important, and it can be, of course, especially nowadays, a complicated relationship. And then number 13 talks about do not depend on other conditions. What does that mean? It means, although previously we talked about adopting, it says adopt the 3 principal conditions. So in other words, take care to accumulate the causes to get the 3 principal conditions for Dharma practice, which was, of course, a spiritual master, a workable mind, or a conducive mind, as well as the external conditions for being able to practice the Dharma. But here in number 13, it says, do not depend on these external conditions. In that, if we have them, great, let's rejoice, nice. But if we don't have all the necessity to do our practice, I don't know, food, water, clothing, whatever is access to water, whatever it is, I mean, nowadays that's hard to believe, but if somehow we're lacking those, we should not make our mind training dependent on them. So we can actually use their lack as a helpful basis for our mind training by transforming the lack of these objects, and then therefore the problems and difficulties that we may experience as a result of them, to transform them into the path of enlightenment. Again, see, is that possible? If it's very noisy where you're practicing, okay? Instead of saying, no, I'm not going to practice, these people are too noisy, this mosquito is just, just can't bear it or whatever. Okay, use that again as a means to mind training, as a means to being patient, to focus the mind back on the object, to realize that just the thought, they're so noisy, it bothers me. That's the obstacle. It's not the noise. It's the thought that it disturbs me. Okay. All right. So, because I took a little longer at the beginning, we weren't able to cover that many points. But anyway, I guess I still feel we can probably finish next Monday. Okay. But let's first do some meditation. Okay. I won't talk about the point I discussed in great detail on the afflictions. This is something as part of your practice of patience. Now, I briefly mentioned patience in the beginning as part of the Lamrim. I'll speak more about it next time, because that's such an important paramita, or important practice of the perfections. But at least we can focus on anger. So to make that your practice for this week, to identify these steps, whether it's attachment, whether it's anger, to make an effort in recognizing them in your own mind, if not in the moment, but maybe going back, remembering certain moments, if not in that same moment. I mean, that may be difficult, but you may go back and just, oh, this morning I had strong anger. Okay, how did I get there, etc. Okay. And of course, then to apply it when there's a new situation again with anger or attachment, and apply the antidote as soon as we can. All right, but then without going through that, let's now do a meditation on the other points we went through today. Okay. We start as we always do with breathing meditation. Okay. So Geshe Chekawa says it's important to adopt the three principal conditions. That is to work towards three important causes. To rely on a qualified spiritual master, a realized master. To work towards a conducive mind. That is confident, diligent, and discerning. And also to work towards the external facilities that we need to effectively practice. So do you find a way to work towards these three? And if we've done so already, to further improve them if necessary. Also, are we free from the three aspects that shouldn't be compromised? So do we have devotion and respect for our spiritual master? And how about enthusiasm and joy in training the mind? And are we mindful, vigilant, and attentive about the actions of our body, speech, and mind? Is there room for improvement? Geshe Chekawa also encourages us or advises us not just to be attentive, mindful, vigilant, and so forth when it comes to our actions of body, speech, and mind, but to never be separate, to never be separated, to never be without virtuous actions of body, speech, and mind. So virtuous actions of the body, which include frustrations, circumambulations. So maybe we have time to include these in our practice. But also in our dealing with other people. To adopt virtuous actions when we drive, virtuous actions of the body when we drive, shop, interact with others, in the form of the facial expressions, for instance, we make. The same applies to the speech. Is there room for improvement? In terms of what we say to people or don't say. Maybe saying mantras when nobody's around. Or engaging in virtuous speech while we interact with others. And of course, our mind should not be separated from virtue. In particular, it shouldn't be separated from the mind of enlightenment. Can we train our mind to constantly remember Bodhicitta? Which of course would mean that if the mind of enlightenment is active, our actions of body and speech are automatically virtuous. Geshe Chekawa also says that we should constantly train towards the chosen objects. In other words, our practice should be pure and unbiased towards all sentient beings. Is our practice unbiased? Or do we make a difference when it comes to the objects of our mind training? We should cherish also all inclusive and deep practices. In other words, all the different techniques for training the mind. Even if right now we don't feel like we can practice them. To value them, or to be at least open to all the extensive and profound practices of mind training. Since they may become important to us sometime in the future. We should also constantly meditate on those who've been set apart. In other words, there are certain living beings we have a particular relationship with. And we should focus our mind training on them. Our relatives, people we are particularly close to, such as our parents, our enemies, our opponents. Those who may mistreat us, even though we've benefited them. And those whom we may find naturally repulsive, or who may find us repulsive due to past karma. Can we focus our mind training more on these different groups of people? And finally, Geshe Chekawa tells us to not depend on other conditions, which basically means that although we need food, we need access to water, an appropriate place to meditate and so forth, we should not make our mind training depend on these objects. Because their lack can actually be helpful for our mind training as part of transforming problems and difficulties into the path of enlightenment. So let's check whether there are situations where we can apply this advice. And now to conclude this short analysis, let's take a moment to focus on whatever conclusion we've come to, whatever insight we may have gained. To apply a single pointed meditation that we're able to internalize this conclusion further. And then let's dedicate all the positive potential we've accumulated today, of course, towards our own enlightenment, however far it may be from our mind right now, but may this become a powerful cause for us to reach the enlightened state of a Buddha. But may it also cause our kind lamas, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama and all other realized masters, to have a long and healthy life, so that they'll continue to guide us through their teachings and their examples. And of course, may the virtue we've accumulated reduce the anger and hatred in the mind of people. And may it enable them to recognize what we all have in common, so that they generate more understanding, more patience, and more compassion for each other. So with this in mind, let's recite the prayers, the dedication prayers. Through the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Shinrezig, Denzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. May the precious Bodhi mind not yet born arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. All right, thank you very much. And I see you again.
Geshe-ma,
Next.
just something to
please.
say,
Sure.
because I just realized that next Monday we have Passover.
Oh, okay.
And the 24th April, next Monday, is our Seder night.
All right.
So it
Oh, yeah,
means
Gila mentioned that.
in Monday and Tuesday we have the evening and then the Shabbat.
Okay.
So
All right. Okay.
I don't know. I had to speak with Reed to know if in Wednesday or Thursday there is nothing in Dharma Friends. So it will be possible to do it if it's okay from you, if you don't have something on these days.
Sure. Yeah, I remember Gila mentioned those 2 dates. Yeah, we could, I think we'll have definitely one more class. Not sure I can finish, but I'll try. And then we could maybe put it on another day, but you discuss it with the Reed and just let me know. Yeah.
Okay, thank you
Yeah.
so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Geshe-ma.
Okay.
Thank you.
all.
Take care. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, dear friend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Geshe-ma. It's Varda.
Yes.
Come to India. I'm leaving. היא כבר לא פה. לילה טוב, דליתי.
לילה טוב.